I built the cabin with my own hands, board by board, over the course of 3 quiet summers. It sat at the edge of a pine-covered ridge, overlooking a narrow lake that barely made it onto local maps. The land had been in my family for decades, long before the surrounding subdivision sprang up with its identical houses, trimmed hedges, and obsession with rules. My cabin wasn't flashy. No fence, no neon paint, no noise. Just wood, stone, and silence. That silence shattered on a Tuesday morning. I was sanding a window frame when I heard tires crunching over gravel. Then came the unmistakable slam of car doors. I looked out the window and saw 2 police cruisers parked near the dirt access road. Behind them stood a woman in oversized sunglasses, arms crossed tightly over a floral blouse. I recognized her instantly. Keran. She was the president of the newly formed Homeowners Association for the neighboring development. We'd crossed paths once before when she informed me, without introduction, that my structure violated HOA codes. I'd calmly told her I wasn't part of the HOA. She'd smiled thinly, like I'd just told her a joke. Now she was back and she'd brought the cops. I stepped outside, wiping dust from my hands. One of the officers approached, polite but firm. "Sir, we've received a complaint about an illegal structure built without permits. We're here to investigate." Keran wasted no time. "That cabin needs to be demolished," she snapped. "It lowers property values and violates HOA standards." I raised an eyebrow. "This land isn't part of your HOA." She scoffed. "That's not what our records say." I almost laughed, but stopped myself. Something about her confidence told me this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. She truly believed she had authority here. The officers asked for documentation. I went inside and returned with a folder I always kept locked in a metal box. Land deeds, surveys, and tax records. I handed them over calmly. Keran leaned in, trying to read over the officer's shoulder, her lips pursed. Minutes passed. The officers exchanged looks. "This land," one officer said slowly, "is privately owned. No HOA jurisdiction." Keran's face tightened. "That can't be right." I crossed my arms. "It is, and this cabin has all the permits it needs." She opened her mouth to argue, but the officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, if you have further concerns, this is a civil matter." Keran stormed back to her car, furious but not defeated. As she drove off, I had the strange feeling this was only the beginning. She thought she'd lost. What she didn't know was that the land beneath her entire HOA was connected to mine, and legally it was mine too. After Keran's furious departure, I went back inside the cabin and sat at my old wooden desk. My hands still trembled, not from fear but from anticipation. This wasn't just a cabin dispute anymore. It had the potential to blow up into something far bigger. She didn't know, but I did. The land she and her HOA claimed. To govern wasn't just adjacent to mine, it overlapped with it in ways that were buried deep in county records. Most people wouldn't think to dig that far. But I always kept a habit of reviewing property maps for fun, tracing old surveys, and comparing them to the new subdivisions springing up around the lake. The HOA had been founded hastily, with a few hundred new homeowners who wanted someone to enforce order. Keran had risen to the top, like a queen bee buzzing over her new hive, and yet in her confidence, she had overlooked one critical detail. My family's deed wasn't just old, it was extensive. It contained a clause that granted ownership, not only of the land beneath my cabin, but also a strip of the surrounding forest, which, by a stroke of historical luck, extended into the HOA's property. I opened a drawer and pulled out the faded deed, running my finger over the embossed seal. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. I owned the land, not just the cabin lot, but swaths of undeveloped territory, including the roads and paths some HOA residents walked on every day. I leaned back in my chair, a slow grin spreading across my face. Keran had been trying to wield power over a place that technically wasn't hers at all. The question was, what should I do next? I could let her rage in ignorance, letting her stubborn attempts to enforce rules fizzle out. Or I could teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. The problem with HOA politics was that people like Keran thrived on appearances and threats. She had assumed that calling the cops would scare me into compliance, that her authority alone would suffice to make me demolish my cabin. But the moment she learned that I had legal control over her precious development, the power dynamic would flip entirely. I decided to test her patience first. Over the next few days, I began walking the property line casually, taking note of areas where HOA members had encroached, fallen fences, shrubs planted outside official boundaries, even an old playground that technically sat on my land. I didn't confront anyone. I simply photographed, measured, and recorded everything. By the end of the week, I had a small dossier ready. Keran thought she was the law. She had no idea I had the documents to prove she was trespassing on my land. And the next time she tried to threaten me, I would be ready to turn the tables. The calm before the storm settled in as I sipped coffee on the cabin's porch. The wind rustled the pines, carrying the faint hum of lawnmowers from the HOA. They thought they owned this space. Soon they'd realize just how wrong they were. Keran didn't waste time. Within a week of her failed attempt to intimidate me, she sent a certified letter. The envelope was thick, crisp, and intimidatingly formal. She laid out every possible violation she could think of: unpermitted structures, encroachment on HOA boundaries, even vague claims about safety hazards. I read it once, twice, then placed it on the kitchen counter. Smiling, I muttered, "You really don't know who you're messing with." The next morning, I called a local title attorney I'd worked with years ago. I explained the situation and showed him the deed. He leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. "Well," he said, "it looks like you have full legal control over this section of the land, including any portions the HOA claims." His grin mirrored my own. "Technically, Keran is trespassing. If she keeps pushing, she's the one at risk." That gave me an idea. Rather than confronting her head-on, I decided to play a slow, strategic game. I began leaving subtle markers along the boundaries, small flags, survey stakes, even temporary signs reading private property that were just visible enough to make a statement without seeming aggressive. I didn't notify the HOA directly, but word spread through the neighborhood gossip chain faster than I expected. Then came the real twist. I discovered that the HOA had been building a small storage shed on what I now knew was part of my property. Their construction crew was meticulous, following all the HOA's regulations, but they had completely ignored the legal ownership of the land. I watched from my cabin as Keran strutted around, clipboard in hand, barking orders. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was treating this land as her own, blissfully unaware that every shovel of dirt she moved was technically trespassing. It wasn't enough to simply prove ownership. I wanted her to understand the full scope of her mistake. I drafted a polite yet firm letter outlining my deed, the overlapping land rights, and her potential liability if she continued encroaching. I included copies of the surveys and legal documents, careful to make the tone civil but undeniable. This wasn't about revenge. It was about flipping the balance of power. The day I delivered it, I watched from a distance as Keran opened the envelope in front of her mailbox. Her initial smirk faltered, replaced by confusion, then disbelief. She looked around, probably hoping someone would explain this away. But there was no one. She had been so sure, so confident, and in a single letter, that certainty was shattered. The HOA had always depended on fear and appearances, but now, the appearance of power belonged to me. Keran had called the cops to demolish my cabin, but she didn't realize she had been playing on my land all along, and that land came with the kind of legal protection even law enforcement couldn't override. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely relaxed. I knew this was only the beginning of a long game. Keran wouldn't give up easily, but I was ready. The days following the letter were strangely quiet. Keran didn't show up at the cabin, didn't send more threatening messages, and, most importantly, she didn't try to call the cops again. Word spread quickly through the HOA community that their president had miscalculated badly. I began noticing subtle changes. Neighbors who once eyed me with suspicion now waved politely when I walked past the boundary lines, and some even nodded in quiet acknowledgement as I strolled near the shared paths that technically belonged to me. But Keran wasn't defeated, she was simmering. A week later, I spotted her car parked at the edge of the property, a safe distance from my cabin. She was on a phone call, pacing and muttering something about legal, counsel, and survey errors. I grinned, let her stew. I had no intention of letting my victory be petty. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about respect and boundaries. I spent my mornings fixing small things in the cabin, tightening the roof, sanding the porch rails, planting wildflowers along the path. Each task reminded me that this space was mine to protect, to enjoy, and to live in peace. I wasn't just defending property. I was defending years of work, sweat, and memories that no HOA president or complaint letter could erase. By the end of the month, Keran had escalated slightly, sending another letter, this time through her attorney. But reading it made me chuckle. She was now demanding joint usage rights and threatening a civil suit. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, who responded succinctly, "All land in question is fully owned by our client. Any further interference will constitute trespassing." The situation finally settled into a strange equilibrium. Keran could no longer use the HOA as a weapon against me, and the cabin remained untouched, a quiet victory in a forest of regulations, rules, and entitled assumptions. Her reputation in the HOA began to shift too. People started to notice that the president of the HOA had misjudged someone who didn't even live in their community. Confidence turned into whispers, whispers into doubt. Sitting on my porch one late afternoon, watching the sun set over the lake, I reflected on the strange series of events. A cabin, a few pieces of paper, and a little patience had outmaneuvered an entire HOA bureaucracy. The peace I felt wasn't just from the absence of confrontation. It was the satisfaction of defending what was rightfully mine, calmly and legally, against someone who underestimated both me and the law. Keran might try again one day, but for now, the cabin stood as it always had. A quiet fortress on my land, a reminder that ownership isn't just about fences or rules, but knowledge, preparation, and the courage to stand your ground. I poured a cup of coffee, leaned back, and smiled. Let her call the cops again. This time I held all the cards. Enjoying this wild story about standing your ground against a HOA? Hit that subscribe button to catch more real-life drama and clever wins. Give this a like if you thought the cabin owner handled it perfectly, and drop a comment below. What would you do if someone tried to boss you around on your own land?